Welcome to our silent cry, where we retell stories that history tried to forget. The faint voices, the silent footsteps, the women who are not allowed to tell their own stories now. They are fully, gently, and sincerely voiced. Here, you will hear little-known historical stories, not because they are unimportant, but because they belong to those who were once considered invisible, women, children, and those marginalized by society. And if today you are looking for a space to rest, relax, or simply want to listen to a story that truly touches the heart, then you are in the right place. Today's story is titled, From Jail to Silence, The Women Punished for Being Unladylike. In 19th century America, prisons were built not only to hold criminals, but also to confine peculiarity, not for murder, not for theft, just for a woman walking faster than expected, speaking louder than permitted, or simply not marrying. At the appropriate age, she could be labeled insane, immoral, or unladylike. And so, she disappeared. No sentence, no trial, just a silent carriage ride, taking her to a place with high stone walls and locked iron gates. There, she was taught how to be obedient, how to sit still, how to be a woman, in the shadows of women's prisons like Blackwell's Island or Indiana Reformatory. Thousands of women were incarcerated, not because they did wrong, but because they didn't conform. They didn't scream, they didn't rebel, they just weren't allowed to be themselves. In a world where obedience was the default standard for women, just a dress that didn't follow the rules was enough to lock a life behind prison doors. The New York air in 1895 still held the chill of early spring. Winds from the Hudson River swept through the streets, past red brick buildings, into narrow alleys where clothes hung on lines between second-story windows. Life was bustling, chaotic, but if you paid close enough attention, you would see eyes constantly watching, not with concern, but with scrutiny. That's where Emma Delaney lived, a 22-year-old girl, working as an assistant in a small tailor shop in the southern part of the city. A place without union voices, without proper breaks, and without dreams big enough to transcend the four walls of the cramped basement. Emma was no different from hundreds of other girls. But there was one thing that made her stand out, or rather, made her a target. Emma liked to wear pants, while most women at the time were still forced to wear ankle-length dresses. Emma chose wide-leg trousers, not too different, but enough for people to whisper. She sewed them from fabric scraps in the workshop, personally altering them to be fitted, neat, and convenient for cycling to work. Women are not allowed to wear pants. That was one of the unwritten rules in almost every city at that time. Some states even had laws prohibiting women from wearing pants unless on horseback. For Emma, wearing pants was not a statement. It was just a personal choice, for comfort. But to society, it was defiance. Emma went to work every morning with brisk steps, in her simple fabric trousers, hair neatly tied up. But that never made others comfortable. The tailor shop manager once called her in and said, "If you want to continue working here, you'd better look more like a lady than a boy." She smiled lightly. "I'm just working as hard as anyone else." That smile did not please him. One April afternoon, after work, Emma walked past Bowery Park. A group of police officers were watching a gathering of unruly teenagers nearby. As Emma walked past, one of the officers frowned. "Hey, you, stop." She stopped, surprised. "What are you wearing? Just pants, sir. You are deliberately dressing like a man. Do you know that is defiant behavior?" Before Emma could say anything, he signaled to his colleague, and within minutes, she was pulled into a carriage, taken straight to the station. In the report, the reason for arrest was recorded: dressing inappropriately for gender norms. Disturbing public order. Just one line, but enough to steer Emma's life in a different direction. No lawyer, no trial. Emma was transferred to a facility called Blackwell's Island Reformatory for Women, built under the guise of educating wayward women, but in reality, a form of imprisonment without sentence. Here, Emma was given a coarse, gray dress, and her hair was cut short to her ears, like everyone else. She was not called Emma, but Prisoner No. 407. The daily schedule was divided into waking up at 5 a.m., collective prayer at 6 a.m., breakfast of thin porridge and hard bread, working from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., washing, sewing, cleaning floors, cutting grass, sitting silently reading scripture for 1 hour. No talking without permission, no showing emotion, no asking why. Emma did not react. She silently observed, and she realized no one here looked like a criminal. Emma's roommate was Ruth, a woman, nearly 40 years old, imprisoned for refusing to marry and living alone. She recounted, "I just wanted to grow my own vegetables, raise chickens, write books. But they said a woman alone was a threat to society." Across from them was Josephine, imprisoned for speaking out against her boss, harassing her. She was. 2 outspoken people said so. And there was Clara, only 16 years old, sent there for talking to boys too much. Emma listened to it all. Every story had a common thread. They did not conform to the mold society had set for a proper woman. Emma did not cry out, did not resist. But she held one thing within her, deliberate silence. When asked to write a self-criticism report to admit her mistakes and commit to becoming a proper lady again, she refused. When punished for not reforming well, she remained silent. She began to secretly write on the inside of her dress hem small, difficult-to-read lines. "I am not guilty. I just wear pants. As a girl, I am not wrong to choose comfort." One day, when the warden searched her belongings and discovered these words, she was put in solitary confinement, a small cell, just enough to sit, with no window, no light. Emma stayed there for 3 days. When she came out, she was thinner, but her eyes were still bright. The months that followed passed like unread diary pages. But Emma remembered every face, every story, every time she was forced to write apologies. It was not a reformatory. It was a place to teach women how to be silent. And it was there that an idea sparked in the mind of the girl who once only wanted to wear trousers, to write it all down, to tell it all, even if no one allowed it. Within those cold stone walls, Emma was not alone. There were dozens, hundreds of faces, each with a reason for imprisonment. But the biggest reason was that they were women who refused to be silent. Mornings at Blackwell's Island prison began not with a bell or sunlight, but with the clanking of iron chains as beds dragged across the stone floor. Emma woke up for the 10th time in her coarse gray dress, her hair so short it no longer hid her deep, sleep-deprived eyes. She sat up, not looking in the mirror, because there were no mirrors here, as if her own reflection was forbidden. Outside the cell door, footsteps echoed rhythmically, repeatedly. Female wardens, holding notebooks, with cold eyes, inspecting each cell. Emma's room had 3 occupants: Emma, Ruth, the oldest woman in this wing, and Clara, the sick girl who often sat with her knees hugged, staring out through the crack in the door. Ruth's full name was Ruth Ellen Monroe. She was 44 years old. She used to live in a small town in Vermont, had her own house and a garden with apples, pumpkins, and blueberry bushes. She didn't marry, didn't have children. She read books, wrote letters to friends in Boston, and made a living selling her homemade pickled cucumbers. Ruth was not loud, did not resist. She simply existed in her own way. And then one day, the local pastor knocked on Ruth's door. He told her that women living alone after the age of 30 were amoral, hazard, a bad example for young women in town. Soon after, Ruth was put on a train to New York and admitted to the reformatory with the file entry, Deviant female behavior refusing the responsibilities of wife and mother. She gave a bitter laugh when telling this to Emma, one evening. By a flickering oil lamp. I used to think I was free. Turns out, I was just unnoticed. Clara was a quiet girl. Whenever asked, she would usually shake her head or nod slightly, her eyes lost, as if searching for someone. Clara entered the reformatory for clandestine behavior with males. But the truth, as Emma later learned, was that Clara had once loved a boy in her class. She only wrote letters to him, nothing more. The letter was discovered by her mother. Her mother, a strict widow, called the police and accused her daughter of having deviant tendencies that needed correction. Clara was brought to the reformatory on her 16th birthday. When Emma asked, "Are you scared?" Clara just replied, "I thought it was my fault." And so Clara stopped speaking from then on. Upstairs was Josephine Dubois, a 29-year-old black woman who used to work as a waitress in a high-end restaurant in Manhattan. One day, when the restaurant owner deliberately sexually harassed her in the storage room, Josephine fought back with a food tray. No one believed her. She was fired. A week later, she was arrested for rude and aggressive behavior in public, while sitting silently on a park bench. At Blackwell's, Josephine was categorized as difficult to reform. She was forced to work twice as hard as other prisoners. But every night, when the candles were extinguished, Josephine would recite poetry in French for those nearby to hear. "I am caged by invisible chains, not because I did wrong, but because I refused to be wrong." She would say Emma was stunned. She had never heard such a peaceful form of resistance. In the evening, they ate together in a large room, with a low ceiling and damp stone walls. The meal consisted only of dark bread, boiled potatoes, and bland broth. No one was allowed to talk during meals. Everyone bowed their heads, eating quickly, as if afraid to be seen. But their eyes still met, fleetingly, but enough to recognize each other as human. Emma, Ruth, Clara, Josephine, and dozens of other faces, some with graying hair, some with scars on their hands, some with red eyes from losing children. Some still held pencils, secretly drawing unknown pictures on tissue paper. All of them were imprisoned because they didn't fit the standard. Blackwell's reformatory never called itself a prison. The warden always emphasized this was a place of reformation, a place to restore feminine values, a second chance. But that was only true if you committed to living by their rules. Speak softly, walk lightly, smile sweetly, apologize if you showed anger, say you were wrong, even if you didn't know where you went wrong. Emma was once asked to write the sentence 100 times, "I should not behave like a man." She only wrote one line, "I am not behaving like a man, I am just being myself." The writing was torn up, and she was transferred to clean toilets for a week. Despite everything being controlled, the women in the reformatory still found ways to keep something for themselves. Josephine sang softly while washing clothes. Ruth told fairy tales through the kitchen fence. Clara occasionally drew flowers on her bed frame with her fingernails. And Emma, she began to memorize every story. No writing, no recording, just memorizing, as if she feared they would be erased if no one kept them. One night, when everyone was asleep, Emma quietly walked out into the prison yard, where dim moonlight fell on dry grass and iron fences. She looked up at the sky, whispering, "If I get out, I will tell it all." A promise no one heard, but also one no one could extinguish. In a world where women's words were considered a danger, silence was no longer surrender, but a quiet, persistent symphony, a kind of music that only those who had been suppressed could feel. Nights on Blackwell's Island were not completely dark. Oil lamps were scattered along the long, winding stone corridors, creating faint, patchy light like weak embers on dark water. In the cells, soft breathing blended with the lonely sounds of insects outside the iron windows, creating an nameless rhythm, sad, familiar, and indefinable. Emma lay on her side, eyes wide open, not out of fear, but because she couldn't sleep in that excessive silence. Silence, when no longer a choice, becomes a heavy weight in the chest. But that night, in the pause between two breaths, Emma heard something else. A melody, unclear, without words, but steady and gentle. In the room across the hallway, Josephine was folding clothes. She wasn't allowed to sing, but each time she folded, she tapped her hands to her own rhythm. Fold once, pause, fold twice, glide, 3 times, twist her wrist. Each movement like a silent note. Emma observed this a few times, then realized Josephine was telling a story with her own body. When they couldn't speak, they sang with their footsteps. When they couldn't cry, they sighed with the wind. When they couldn't resist, they looked at each other for a long time, as if sending a secret message. One afternoon, when it was raining lightly, Clara sat by the cell window. She didn't speak, didn't move much, just placed her hand on the iron frame. Emma sat a few meters away. Suddenly, she heard a faint tapping sound from Clara's fingers. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause. Emma blinked. She understood immediately. It was a form of rhythmic code, not accidental. Clara was playing a song without an instrument, without words, without a melody anyone could record. But Emma heard it, because it was the symphony of oppressed silence. Ruth could no longer write. Paper and pen were restricted items, but she had an extraordinary memory. Every evening, when no one was paying attention, Ruth would lean back against the wall and close her eyes. "I'm reading a book," she whispered to Emma. "You don't have a book. In my head, I remember every word, every sentence." And then she began to recite, from memory, an ancient passage from a novel she had loved since she was 20. A woman does not belong in the kitchen. She belongs where she is heard. Emma etched that sentence deeply into her heart. Ruth didn't talk much, but in every imagined reading, there was a whole symphony of longing to live, to be free, to be oneself. Every person in the reformatory, despite their circumstances, seemed to have developed a unique language of silenced women. Some secretly sewed flower patterns onto handkerchiefs. Some arranged their beds in a circle, instead of a straight line as required. Some used only their eyes to tell stories, with gentle, or fierce, or fearful, or determined gazes. Emma began to commit all these living notes to memory. A woman broke her fingernails from washing clothes for too long, but still picked up every stray thread, because that was something she could control. A young girl only smiled when she saw birds flying past the window, as if it was a secret code between her and the outside world. An old woman mumbled prayers, but each word emphasized the names of forgotten women. All of it was a symphony without a score, but full of emotion. Late one evening, as Emma was helping with laundry, she saw Josephine standing by the wash basin, the light reflecting on her dark skin like burning bronze under a sunset. "Emma," Josephine said, her voice a clear whisper, "do you think we are weak because we don't scream?" Emma shook her head. "No, I think you are strong, but in a way that no one can see." Josephine smiled sadly. "That's how we survive. They teach us to be silent. So we turn silence into something inextinguishable. We let silence become the music they can never decipher." One day, the reformatory warden announced, "All prisoners must publicly read a pledge of rehabilitation." When it was Emma's turn, she stepped onto the platform. She looked down at the paper, where the words were printed, "I regret my behavior inappropriate for the female ideal." Emma lifted her head and said nothing at all. She stood there, silent, straight, looking directly at the warden. The entire room held its breath. They thought she would be dragged away, but no. 1 second, then 2 seconds, then 10 seconds passed, and a small round of applause erupted from the back of the room. It was Josephine, then Ruth, then a few others. No one said anything. just light applause, like a silent exclamation mark. That night, Emma rewrote everything in her memory. Clara's tapping rhythm, Ruth's recited words, Josephine's gaze. She didn't need paper or pen, because she knew, one day, these symphonies would be rewritten with real voices, with words, with light, and when that day came, people would have to listen. There are letters that never reached their recipients, but not because they lacked words, but because society did not allow those words to be spoken. May winds blew through the cell windows of Blackwell's Island. In that wind, there was the rustle of paper, light as a whisper at the end of a dream. But in a place where everything was controlled, from words to gazes, the sound of paper rubbing against hands was an act of rebellion. Emma was writing, not in a notebook, not on a table, but on the inside of a piece of fabric, cut from an old nightgown she obtained while doing laundry. She used a sewing needle and black thread. Each letter was a trembling stitch, each line was a long breath. Each paragraph was a part of her heart. It was not just a letter. It was everything that had never been said. She began the letter with an unnamed greeting. No one specific, but to all those who never knew of the existence of a place like Blackwell's. If you read this letter, please know, this place does not only imprison those who have erred, but those who have lived differently from the mold society set for them. She wrote about Ruth, the woman who grew her own plants, and was considered unusual simply because she didn't want to marry. She mentioned Josephine, who was judged as aggressive, just for daring to say no to her boss. She whispered about Clara, the girl who didn't speak, didn't smile, but tapped rhythms like the music of an abandoned heart. And then, finally, she wrote about herself. She didn't complain, didn't resent. She just said that on the day she was arrested, she never thought something as simple as clothing could determine a person's worth. I never wanted to be a hero. I just wanted to walk to work without being judged. The words were not ornate, but when placed in delicate stitches, they became heartbreakingly moving. She didn't know who would read it, wasn't sure how long it would remain hidden, but she knew the letter needed to exist, because otherwise, silence would swallow their memories. The embroidered fabric was folded small, neatly like a handkerchief. Emma gave it to Ruth, who once had a friend who worked as a nurse outside the reformatory. Maybe she doesn't remember me anymore, Ruth said, but if somehow this handkerchief gets out of here, it might reach someone who knows what to do. It was a fragile hope, but it was all they had. That evening, Ruth hid the letter in the hem of her petticoat, the least expected place. When it was her turn for a routine health check, she discreetly slipped it into a crack in the wall near the medical area, where mice used to nest. There was no news, no sign that the letter was found. Emma didn't dare to ask, didn't dare to hope too much. But then, one sudden rainy afternoon, while cleaning the dining room floor, Josephine whispered, "I heard some nurses talking about a strange piece of fabric. They don't know what it is. They can't read it because the letters are sewn too small." Emma paused, her heart pounding. Then what? They were going to burn it. But one person secretly kept it. A few weeks later, something unprecedented happened at Blackwell's reformatory. A group of female reporters from the local newspaper appeared, carrying permits to investigate living conditions in reformatories. No one knew why they were allowed in. No one said it. But Emma, Ruth, and Josephine knew. Clara smiled for the first time in months. They were not allowed to talk to the reporters, but their eyes met like a shared melody, whispering, "The letter has been read." The reformatory was not closed. The warden was not fired. But a few weeks later, Emma was allowed to leave the reformatory earlier than expected for good behavior. Ruth was transferred to a nursing home near Vermont. Clara, according to her new guardian, would be moved to live with a former teacher who used to tutor difficult children. Josephine remained, but was assigned to the sewing section, where she could sing softly while working. On the day she left the reformatory, Emma wore the gray dress she had lived in 4 months. She didn't cry, didn't look back, but as the gate closed behind her, she raised her hand to her chest, where the letter had once rested in her imagination, and whispered, "We spoke, even without words." Emma did not return to the old tailor shop. She went to work at a small bookstore, where she could read, could write, and most importantly, could be herself. In a local newspaper a few months later, there was a short article, a hand-embroidered piece of fabric with a woman's account from a reformatory spread throughout feminist organizations as proof of imposed silence and the power of memory. No one knew the writer's name, no one knew who Emma was, but she read that article with shining eyes on a soft afternoon, and she knew her silence had not been in vain. From jail to silence, the women punished for being unladylike is not just Emma's story. It is a reminder that throughout history, thousands of voices have been silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they refused to be obedient. If you are hearing this, perhaps you too have felt that you didn't fit a certain mold. And if so, remember that silence is not weakness. It is where quiet resilience begins. Thank you for listening to the end of this story. If you find value in the whispers of the past, don't forget to subscribe to the Her Silent Cry channel so we can together unearth buried memories. Wishing you a peaceful sleep and a tomorrow gentle enough to continue listening to untold stories.